again to all the writers around the world. This is your personal writing mentor, Jim Parsons from Australia, and this is lesson 11 of the course, Write That Novel Now. Today I'll be looking further at writing in third person. In particular, I'll be doing some comparisons between all the third persons and looking particularly hard at third person multiple voice. I want to spend a little more time on third person limited to clarify an issue. Just what is limited? It certainly does not mean that you can only talk about one person. Not at all. In fact, in third person limited, you are able to talk about as great a range of people as if you were using third person omniscient. What's the difference? Well, what's limited? You're not limited in talking about people. Talk about anyone you like. But when it comes to getting inside a person's head, you're limiting yourself to one person, the protagonist, the main person. Whereas in third person omniscient, you can dive into everybody's head. Here's a piece that I've written to try to illustrate this point. This is third person limited, and I'm limiting the point of view to one character only, whose name is Paul. And I won't read it right through and then come back. I'll pause here and there and talk you through it. So let's have a look at the start of it. You'll see that everybody gets a mention. We're not in Paul's head. We're not in anybody's head. This is the narrator speaking generally. Paul pulled into the gutter outside the block of units to pick up Nan and Fredo. His friends were, as always, ready at the appointed time, impatient for a good night out. Fredo was an IT specialist who fancied the high life, even though he didn't have the budget for it. He did like designer label shirts and expensive shoes, and that took most of his spare cash. Nan was the complete opposite. Scruffy jeans and a jacket from the charity shop were all she needed to make her happy. So you see, this isn't Paul's perspective. This is the narrator telling you a little bit about these two friends. And now we get a tiny bit of backstory. Again, it's not Paul telling you this, it's the narrator. Referring to Nan, she worked for the same IT company that Fredo did. In fact, they had first met outside the interview room when they applied for the same job. There had been two going. Much to Fredo's disgust at the time, Nan had been offered the better position. But they were now close friends. Paul grinned as they climbed into the back seat together. All right, now we've got some action. Paul is smiling as they get into the back seat together. He says, "Hi, you two, how's things?" He frowned at the mumbled offhand responses. Now, up till that point, this is still a narrator telling you what Paul did. But watch this neat little switch into Paul's own thoughts. He frowned at the mumbled offhand responses. Something was definitely up. What the heck? Had they had a fight about something? Damn, that was going to put a damper on the night out. Probably better to get it over with right away, clear the air. So even the something was definitely up. There's a casual sound to that. It's more colloquial speech. And so we're hearing that trigger that we're moving into Paul's own voice. And so Paul says, "Okay, out with it. What's going on? You're sulking, Nan, I can tell." It was Fredo who answered. "Leave it alone, mate. It's not something your breezy mediation is going to fix in an instant." Okay, so that is just the narrator talking, but not this time. This is back into Paul's POV. Well, that was one person's opinion. He risked a quick look over his shoulder. Nan? Even the he risked a quick look over his shoulder. The term risk implies that there's a value judgment there, right? So we're back in Paul's POV again. "Some other time, Paul, just pick up Tony or we'll all be late." It was so unlike Nan to be short with him. Now you notice we're using him, which means we are allowed to believe this is Paul's own thoughts. If I'd written, "It was so unlike Nan to be short with Paul," we're back with the narrator again because the narrator is calling him by name. Remember what I told you. Use the character's name and it's the narrator. You're talking about him. But here, it's Paul's own voice. "It was so unlike Nan to be short with him. She was usually the group's little ray of sunshine." And again, because this is colloquial language, we are firmly in Paul's head. Something shitty had happened, a rift between her and Fredo. Had Fredo come onto her, spoil the beautiful friendship, so to speak? Clearly this is Paul's thoughts. We're back to Paul's POV. Now we move back to what is probably standard narration. The silence in the car was oppressive. After a block or two, he couldn't stand it any longer and punched the car radio button. Now it's possible even using the he there allows the reader to believe we're still hanging on to Paul's POV. And this next bit is definitely in Paul's POV because he calls his friend an idiot. This is not the role of the narrator. The narrator doesn't use loaded terms like that. When he pulled in at Tony's house, of course the idiot was nowhere to be seen. He blew the horn. And now we move out of Paul's POV, and this is just the general narration, telling us stuff about Tony. Tony was the youngest of the group. He was still at uni and living with his parents. He had an "I'll fix that tomorrow" attitude, a policy he had already applied to several failed subjects. His parents despaired of him ever completing his studies or getting a job. They were resigned to him being a permanent but non-paying lodger. So there's a slight difference there that tells you that that is just general narration, not Paul's own voice. So I hope that helps you understand the difference, that we're only looking at Paul. We're only ever getting inside the head of the protagonist, third person limited. Now, you're probably heartily sick of this passage, as I am, but I want to change it all now, a passage that you're familiar with, and show you the difference between that point of view, limited POV, and omniscient narration. So you would recognise this. Let's jump down to Fredo. He did like designer label shirts and expensive shoes, and that took most of his spare cash. It's a line you're familiar with. Right now, Fredo was stepping from foot to foot. Now, what have I done here? I've tried to bring what was a general statement about Fredo back to the present moment. Now the reader is looking at Fredo on the footpath, on the pavement, and he's stepping from foot to foot, and I'm suggesting to the reader they're going to hear Fredo's voice. And they do. This could be no one else. Where the hell was Paul? It was downright awkward standing here with Nan. What a fool he'd been. Okay, suddenly we're hearing Fredo's voice. Then we get to talk about Nan. Nan was the complete opposite in clothing taste, scruffy jeans, etc., etc. We know all that. We know about her being in the IT company. That was all, and still is, general narration. The narrator is telling us that part. Get to the line, but now they were close friends. And look what I've done again. Nan sneaked to look at Fredo's doll face. Right? We're asking the reader to look at Nan now. Look at Nan looking at Fredo. And we know Nan. We're going to hear Nan's voice. Nan sneaked to look at Fredo's doleful face. Perhaps she'd been too blunt, sounded too outraged. Oh well, he'd just have to get over it. She hoped they could stay friends. Then we get back to some narration, action. Paul grinned as they climbed into the back seat. He says hello to them, right? And we get Paul's POV for the first time now. Something was definitely up. What the heck? Had they had a fight about something? That's a line that you're familiar with. And he says, you're sulking, Nan, I can tell. But it was Fredo who answered. Leave it alone, mate. It's not something your breezy mediation is going to fix in an instant. And now, once Fredo has spoken, we can continue with his thoughts. He hoped Paul would take notice. The trouble was that Paul in counsellor mode was pretty hard to shut up. So that's definitely Fredo's voice we're hearing. Then another line that you are familiar with from the previous reading. Well, that was one person's opinion. He risked a quick look over his shoulder. That was Paul, if you recall. Now it seems odd, doesn't it? Because there's this jump from hearing Fredo's voice to this one. It could still be Fredo. So we will have to put in something to redirect the reader's attention to Paul. So what could we say? We could say, it was pretty. The trouble was that Paul in counsellor mode was pretty hard to shut up. Paul brown. Well, that was one person's opinion. In other words, we direct it back to Paul and let people know that that's whose head we're now in. When he says Nan, she says, some other time, Paul, just pick up Tony or we'll all be late. We know that line. But now I've added, Nan avoided his gaze. We want the reader to swing their head and look at Nan. She hated including Paul in the disagreement, but he did insist on interfering. Definitely Nan's voice. And now we have Paul again. It was so unlike Nan to be short with him. We know that line. But once again, it sounds odd without some sort of intervention, without some sort of a switch back. So what if we said Paul winced? It was so unlike Nan to be short with him. She was usually the group's little ray of sunshine. Then we blather on again about them being in the car and the radio. And finally, they pull up outside Tony's place. We have the narrator telling us all about Tony. And now I've added a little bit right at the end, talking of Tony's parents. They were resigned to him being a permanent but non-paying lodger. Tony was taking his time in the shower. See how the camera zooms in. Instead of looking at the whole family, it zooms in on Tony. Oh dear, Tony in the shower. Yes, Tony was taking his time in the shower. They'd wait. He knew that. Oh, sure, they'd all swear at him and claim they'd never wait again, but they always did. Well, I hope you get the idea. That's omniscient narration. It's like a game of ping pong. You feel as though you're looking backwards and forwards from each person as you're watching what's going on in their heads. It works in some books. It does keep you distant, keeps you away from what's really going on in one person's head. And it's entirely up to you, but I would really recommend that you learn how to use third person limited, or what we're going on to next, which is multiple voice. Okay, third person multiple voice. I guess the name says it all, although don't confuse it with omniscient narration. Omniscient is the free-for-all. Third person multiple voice sits between omniscient narration and third person limited. Third person limited, you're only allowed to hear one person's voice. You're only allowed to get inside one person's head. With third person multiple voice, obviously, you're allowed inside two people's heads, or three or four. Bear in mind what I said way back in lesson 2 or 3. The more you share the love around, the less there is in this case. Don't have so many different narrating voices that the reader fails to zero in on one of them and really start to care about them. But having two people's voices can be useful in many situations. For example, if you're writing a romance, it's quite good to know what both parties in the romance are thinking. And of course, if you're writing a murder mystery, it's not usual to know what the killer is thinking. I mean, that's what the word mystery means. That's the mystery. Of course, there are people that attempt to show the killers by just talking darkly about he did this, he thought that, he walked here. POV, getting inside the killer's head, and in doing so, conceal the killer's identity. Now, you have to be pretty cautious here. Are you intriguing the reader or just plain irritating them? Getting the killer's perspective all the way through the book, never being given a name, can just downright ping the reader off. So please be cautious about some of these lesser used techniques. In an adventure story, it certainly can be useful to get the bad guy's perspective. For example, if you have shown your hero painstakingly working out over a number of chapters where the killer or the baddie is hiding, where his hideout is, and he figures it out, finally figures it out, so he's ready to move in on the killer. And then you switch to the baddie's point of view, get inside the baddie's head, and you're able to show that this antagonist is way ahead of your hero and has moved premises, having set the original premises up with a bomb as a booby trap. Now, okay, I'm using tried and trite storylines, right? Cliches, but I don't want you to be distracted by the story itself. I want you to be able to see what I'm driving at here. So in situations like that, it can be riveting to get two perspectives on something. You can even stretch to 3 or maybe 4, and it can be done. For example, you've got the cop, you've got the killer, And you might introduce someone else. It could be, let's say, the president or the prime minister with his family getting ready to go to his office or something like that. And we might wonder initially what this chapter is doing here. Why are we seeing this person? And later we realise that basically they're all going to meet in the middle, that the president is going to be somewhere, the killer is going to attempt to assassinate him, and the cops are working overtime to try and figure out who is the next victim or who the killer is. So in those instances, yes, it's quite good to have several different viewpoints. So that's your first real decision. Do I even need multiple voice? Is a single voice going to do the job better? And if you have made the decision, yes, 2 voices or 3 voices is much better, then you have to work out how you're going to organise this. Decisions. And in fact, I've seen so many novice writers give up at this point. They think it's all about writing, when in fact it's about decisions and organising material, organising the way you're going to present material. Usually with multiple voice, we like to dedicate an entire chapter to one voice and then move on and devote the next chapter or a subsequent chapter to the second voice. So we might start out with Jack. We make it clear to the reader that they're in Jack's head in chapter 1. Write chapter 2, and we make it clear that we're now in Jill's head. Write chapter 3, and in that opening sentence, we mention Jack again. So we're jumping backwards and forwards between Jack and Jill. That makes sense? Now, does it have to alternate chapters? No, that's just one technique. And of course, it sets you up with a real problem, because then you have to think of something to say for each character, for each chapter, and that can be a burden. It may be that you choose to have 2 chapters by Jill or 3 chapters by Jill, and then just slot in 1 by Jack, and then go back to Jill again for a couple, and then go back to Jack for 1, so that one of your voices predominates, but the other one gets a look in occasion. What you mustn't do is to start the book off with 1 character, get halfway through, and suddenly throw in a chapter out of the blue by a second character. This will really perplex the reader. They are making the presumption that they're inside one person's head, and suddenly they're not. If you know that you're going to put in another character's POV very sparsely, right, might be 1 in 5 chapters will be given over to a second character, please try to get that character's perspective in an early chapter, even if you have to make it a little artificial. Show both your characters that you're going to use as POV characters early, even if you abandon one for a little while. Does that make sense? So that your reader understands that there will be 2 voices here, folks. And this is also true if you're going to use 3 or more voices. Try to give them all a turn, although sometimes you might follow through with 2 voices halfway through the book, and then the nutty professor turns up and suddenly you start including him in the story as well. If a character arrives late, they can still be a POV character at that point. So many different ways to organise your writing, and these are all things you need to take into account. So, do you need to make it chapters, entire chapters? Well, it really reads well to do this, to swing over. At chapter turnover, that's a great place to change not only settings, but also the point of view you're showing your reader. It's very awkward if basically you've only got a paragraph or 2. It doesn't make much of a chapter, does it? If you only have very limited things to show your reader from one of those characters, it may be better not to have them there at all. The other technique, of course, and I'm sure you've seen it, is to have what we call a page break, which is quite distinct from taking a new page to start a new chapter. A page break is a break in the middle of your text. It could be using 3 asterisks. It could be using a tiny little line. Some authors can manage it by using a 2 or 3 line gap, and that's enough to signify that there's a break in this page. And when you do that, you can move backwards and forwards between characters without devoting an entire chapter to each. That's if you've just got little bits you'd like to say. But again, be cautious about this. If you do it too frequently, if you do tiny little pieces, 1 sentence or 1 small paragraph, and then go back again, you're creeping into omniscient viewpoint. So make these decisions early on. Do I have enough material to warrant giving a second viewpoint or a third viewpoint? Now, I'll just briefly illustrate some of those points I've made. And please be aware that I'm always happy to take questions. If there's something you don't get, if there's something you don't understand or you'd like me to clarify, I'm always happy to do that. Track down my email address. I usually put it at the end of most of the lessons, and just send the question to me. Okay, let's have a look at some of these things briefly. Now, as an example of the use of multiple voice, I've chosen a manuscript of mine that I abandoned some years back, but it's a good example of what I want because it has 3 different POVs. So it's multiple voice, and it starts off with my serial killer who's ensconced in a small country town. He's been lying low for a few years, hasn't killed. He believes he's forced into it again because the girl has been nasty to him. So we meet Willie Agosto in chapter 1. I wanted to set it up that there's trouble brewing in this little town. And so that chapter goes on for about 3 pages. And then I set up who is going to be having to deal with Willie Agosto disturbing his quiet little town. And that is the police sergeant, the local sergeant, Ivan Tyrrell. And so I introduce Ivan Tyrrell going about his normal duties, demonstrate that the place is not the sort of place one expects to find a serial killer lurking. So that's chapter 2. And in fact, I stay with Ivan Tyrrell, the policeman, for chapters 2 to 4. In other words, 3 chapters in a row. Then I cut back to Willie Agosto, because by this stage, Willie has captured a girl. So that's chapter 5. Chapters 6 and 7 are devoted to the policeman again, and a girl has gone missing, so no talk about her being murdered yet. Then, in chapter 8, I jump to my third person. Remember I said that sometimes you don't have to introduce someone immediately. I introduced my 2 main characters, got the story going, and then I cut to a fellow called Matt Besserton, who lives in the very rugged ranges near Armidale in northern New South Wales, what's often called the Waterfall Way, rugged gorges, and Matt owns a farm there. The reason I need Matt in the story is because Matt spent some years in the same orphanage as Willie Agosto, so he knows him. Willie knows where Matt lives, and when Willie's in trouble, he heads bush and ends up at Matt's place and taking Matt's wife hostage. So I need to establish Matt early and just the sort of guy he is and where he is. So that's chapter 8. Chapters 9 to 11, 3 chapters in a row, back to the policeman. Chapter 12 is Matt Besserton again, this time a backstory showing what he knows about how ugly Willie Agosto was as a boy at the orphanage, where we see his nasty tendencies emerging. Chapter 13 to 15, back to the policeman again. Chapter 16, the serial killer Willie, and then chapters 17 to 18, back to the policeman. Now, that's only a small portion of the book, but I thought you might be interested in the statistics. Those 18 chapters occupy 73 pages, roughly 4 pages a chapter. I like shorter chapters. I can jump around a lot more and I don't have to use page breaks. It works out approximately 1,900, 2,000 words per chapter. That's my style. Other people have 4,000 and 6,000 word chapters. That's fine. So the breakdown is, of those 18 chapters, 13 of them are devoted to Ivan Tyrrell. So clearly the policeman, the man who's got to deal with this problem, is the main voice that I want people to hear. 13 chapters so far. 3 go to Willie, the killer, and 2 go to establishing this third party, Matt Besserton. So that's probably a third of the book, if I ever get to finish it. And it gives you an idea of how to handle 3 different voices, that it doesn't have to be very orderly. There are right places and wrong places to fit these chapters in, and they were all decisions I had to make. I hope that's been useful for you. Well, that's the end of lesson 11. If you'd like some other exercises on converting first person to third person or converting a telling document into a show document, then you can obtain those from me by emailing me for a copy at writing-course@hotmail.com. But really what I think you should be concentrating on is the first chapter writing competition. It's due in next week. You only have 1 week to get your entry in. It's such an easy competition. Write the first chapter of any genre, get all the details and the rules and regulations from, I think it was lesson 8. If you can't find them, email me. Again, I'll give you the email address. Email me and I'll very rapidly send you all the entry details so that you can get your entry in, because you could win a full year's mentoring with me. Professional mentoring worth $700-800. Well worth entry. So think about that. 1 week to get that entry in. Until next week, goodbye and keep safe.